Hello and welcome to this screencast on Servoy with Visual FoxPro, an introduction, bringing Visual FoxPro apps to the web and more. I'm Ken Levy. I'm the former product manager for Visual FoxPro at Microsoft and a longtime developer in the FoxPro community, going back almost 25 years. I designed and created tools that ship in Visual FoxPro, such as the class browser. And I've been using Servoy, finding that it's an excellent development platform for enhancing existing FoxPro applications, connecting to DBF data, as well as building new components or new apps based on existing Visual FoxPro apps. Now, as an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I will give a detailed summary of what Servoy is, the various components, its architecture, especially compared to Visual FoxPro. I'll talk about the deployment scenarios, the runtime model, and some introduction to pricing. And then I'll kind of summarize with some case studies, screenshots, give you an idea of some apps that have been built with Servoy, and summarize on resources. There are no demos in this screencast, slides only. It's just an introduction, and there'll be a whole series of demo-centric screencasts that I do, and you can find those all on the FoxPro specific landing page, servoy.com/FoxPro. As a quick introduction, Servoy is great for Visual FoxPro developers. It's actually fairly easy to learn for an existing FoxPro developer. It's a fast, rapid application development environment, great tool set, very data-centric, and there's existing FoxPro developers and ISVs that have FoxPro apps that have adopted Servoy and built entirely new apps and deployed and are very happy with it, and a lot of them take their FoxPro experience and really benefit when developing in Servoy. Now, as an overview, a good thing to understand right off the get-go is that Servoy is an application server. It's not a database. It does not have its own database engine natively. Think of it as a set of developer tools combined with an application server for deployment, and there is a local app server that runs when you're kind of in like developer mode. And you can connect to various database servers, and I'll talk more about that in an upcoming slide. There is a native and web client, and what that means is if you're in Windows, it's like a Windows form. If you're on a Mac, it's a Mac form, so on. And there is also a web client, which means browser-based. The really interesting thing and fairly unique is that it's all based from one code base. For example, you go into the solution and you add a new form. And you add your controls, add some code, and there's actually two different run buttons on the toolbar or hotkey, and you can run the native client, which is, again, like a Windows or a Mac form or a Linux, and then you can run the web form, which brings up your default browser, and it's based on the same code base, meaning you don't do anything different in your controls or your code behind the form and so on. It's all based on one code base, and it all executes on the server. And it's a really kind of unique model that way, and it's a great tool for bringing data-centric apps to the web, either simultaneously or depending on which form you're running. You might say this one's a web form, this one's a rich client form. Servoy is cross-platform, cross-browser. You can essentially install the Servoy development tools right on Windows. You can install it on Mac, Linux. You can install the application server on those same platforms. Again, it doesn't have a native database, but it does use a database as its own repository. So there has to be some database that gets included. Now, Servoy is moving to PostgreSQL, just recently announced, as the default database for its repository. And you can actually use that database, if you choose, as your application database. You can actually have one database for its own repository. That's basically when you code your app and you set up metadata and all that. That's how it gets stored, and that's how you would deploy it on your application server. And you can have an entirely different database optionally for the data for an app. Of course, you can have different apps with different databases and all that. You just create connections and manage them through your development environment. You can also connect with Sybase tools. For example, there's SQL Anywhere, and Servoy is a partner with Sybase, so you can optionally get Servoy that includes the Sybase SQL Anywhere database as its repository, and then you can build apps with it. And that's essentially what Servoy has been doing for a while. They're moving the upcoming version as a default to PostgreSQL, but the Sybase SQL Anywhere is still an option as part of the install. And if you want, after you install, you can switch the repository to any of the other databases. Another thing I'll mention is Sybase Advantage Database Server. It's a very good database for connecting to existing DBFs. It has native DBF database format optionally, and so you can use Advantage Database Server to connect directly to DBFs, and they have their own JDBC driver, and you can essentially go from Servoy through the Sybase Advantage Database Server JDBC driver, and then have that database advantage basically connect to your DBFs, and then you could of course store some of your data in that database as well. I'll probably talk about that in future standalone screencasts. There is a JDBC driver that you can obtain from Servoy for free that supports DBFs. So you can go into Servoy and connect right to DBFs, and you don't have to change your existing FoxPro app at all in order for you to build a Servoy app that connects to FoxPro data. Now, if you want, you can, of course, pass the 2 gig limit and all that, depending on which database you're using. It pretty much, that's the case if you move your data out of a DBF file format. Now, you'll see this term, acronym SaaS, right? Software as a Service. It's very growing in popularity, and that's kind of, there's a momentum in this decade for a lot of apps to move towards the cloud and a software as a service model. And there's also a disconnected model with Servoy, so you can run when you're not connected to the application server, and then it will sync up the data when you do make that connection. But a big factor here is you get all the benefits of having kind of a remote client without having to use things like Citrix or Terminal Server and all that. And then, of course, the deployment is a lot simpler because there's no runtime per application to install on the client. You just point to the app and run it, and then if there's a change to the app, let's say you have dozens or hundreds of users, they'll pick up the update when it's deployed on the server. Now, some of the components to Servoy, and let's talk about the developer side first. When you install Servoy, and you can install it on Windows, you can install it on Mac or Linux. I actually have it running on both my Windows desktop. I have some virtual PC images that I have running Windows XP, and it runs great there. And then I have a Mac with Snow Leopard, and I run Servoy Developer on that. It's fully compatible. It's all based on Eclipse, which is open source, and it's essentially extending the IDE for Eclipse. Even more than just a standard plugin, it's a very custom, enhanced version of Eclipse. In fact, a little tip is when you have a Servoy installed and you go into Eclipse on the menu and check for updates, you need to disable and checkbox off the Eclipse update if there is one, and only install the Servoy update, because Servoy will automatically update any components to Eclipse that are needed automatically. Otherwise, you'll just end up installing more of a clean version of Eclipse overriding the Servoy. Now, on the Java runtime, that's a requirement because Servoy is based on the Java runtime, or JSE, and you have to install that. Now, on a lot of Macs, I believe that's pretty much installed for you already. But on a typical Windows machine, you may just have to go to the Java runtime download page. It's free, and just download it, and then you can install the server, the developer version. Now, Java Beans is a kind of a component for the developer version. Just like the way you might build ActiveX controls on a FoxPro form, there is a toolbar with different Java Bean controls that you could drop onto a form. JavaScript is the primary programming environment, programming language, and it's a really good language for a Visual FoxPro. It's very dynamic. There's all kinds of data-centric framework objects and classes that are part of Servoy, and there's IntelliSense and color and everything else inside the IDE when you're programming. You can jump into and program in Java when you need to. If there were some certain things that you needed to access that are lower level, or you just like programming in Java, there's ways you can do that. But for the most part, most Servoy developers just program in JavaScript, and all the code gets run on the server. So even if you're building a web app in Servoy, it actually executes all of your code through Ajax on the server, and it's kind of like a very lightweight client. None of your JavaScript comes down. You don't program the browser DOM object or script or do any kind of things like that on the client side of the browser when you build a web app. It's all server based. Now there's JDBC drivers, as I said, and that's like a separate component. And then there's a repository for Servoy itself, how it stores its own metadata and when you build your app. Just like FoxPro has SCX, VCX, DBC files, PJX files, these are all DBFs, right? You can open them up in FoxPro, and it's using the FoxPro DBF engine to manage those natively. Servoy does something similar in the fact that it uses whatever repository database is set up, and it manages all your data. So when you add a control to a form or create a new form, you're actually updating the repository database. And of course, like I said earlier, you can have any database be your application database. It may be the same. It's totally up to you. Now, the Servoy has an application runtime, and what that is when you run your app, you deploy it. It's similar to a database server. You put it on a server machine. Again, it could be across platform. Doesn't matter what platform you install the server on. And then you connect to it, let's say, over HTTP, and it could be a network, intranet, or internet, depending on how it's deployed. And you can host it yourself. You can use a cloud service, like Amazon or anything, or you can go it through an ISP, and there's other options through Servoy to host your application. A lot of it's going to depend on, how it gets deployed, the scale of it, and all that. And when you install the developer version, you pretty much get a local application server. So when you, for instance, run a form and kind of run it, test it, and debug it, you're running a local instance of the application server itself. And it's kind of cool because you can actually go to another machine and access your application, and you can fully manage the server through this web client and in the developer tools. And the developer version, the community edition, is free, and you get all of this, and you can pretty much build a Servoy app with the community edition for free. And one other thing I should mention is that when Servoy developers cross-platform, you can take a project, including parts of the data or all of the data, and actually export it into a single file. It's a .servoy file, and if you rename that file, it's actually a zip file. And that's even cross-platform as well. So I can go into Windows and I can build a new solution in Servoy, and then I can, connect to a database, maybe add data, or there's data already there. I can build a couple of forms, like a one-to-many, and so on. And then I can basically take that solution and export it. Creates this one file, .servoy. I can go onto my Mac, and I can essentially import that project, all the code, all the forms, the controls, everything's there. If there is data, you'll have to have a database set up for you to connect to, and it'll ask you, do you want to bring in the data, and so on. Maybe it's for a sample or for testing purposes or whatever. But it's really cool that you can do that, and it's a great way to kind of have your whole app be nice and portable. You don't have to do any kind of manual zipping yourself and all that, and it does a lot of updating as needed in the IDE when something gets imported. Servoy is very standards compliant. It supports native SQL for accessing data and programming. As a matter of fact, while a lot of FoxPro developers know SQL, use the select statement directly in FoxPro, or there's a lot of things you can do with their own object model and the native IDE and the application server and all that doesn't require you to do a lot of SQL unless you choose to do it. There's all kinds of things like calculated fields and aggregated fields, and you can do a lot without writing SQL, but it does support standard SQL. The developer tools are all based on Eclipse. There is basically JavaScript for your programming, but you can use Java Beans as needed, and you can even use Java to program, as I mentioned. It all uses standard HTTP web services and XML for exchanging the data over the web or over its own network. There's things like RTF, HTML, text rendering. You can even do interesting things like you want to use text merge functionality, just like in FoxPro. You can go into the tooltip property of let's say a label or a control or something, and you can actually add an expression, a JavaScript expression that will evaluate at runtime. You can even embed HTML in the text that will get evaluated and at runtime. So you could actually have, for example, the tooltip or some label of a control that is executed and determined, evaluated at runtime, and it could even have like a hyperlink from HTML in that text, things like that. There's PDF support, and there's all kinds of email protocols for that kind of functionality when you need it. Now, Servoy is a three-tier architecture model that, and it's an application server. When you're programming in Servoy, you don't actually connect directly to the data. You connect to the application server. Everything you're programming is against the application model. It's like a framework. And Servoy does all the updating of the database directly. Now, there are certainly methods that you could call to have the application server manually flush and update the database or refresh the application server cache and the objects you're working with, these things called found sets, and you can control the functionality, but essentially you're kind of on autopilot or cruise control, so to speak. And Servoy does a lot of the data updating to the raw database that you're connected to manually. And there's a lot of benefits to actually running an application server. For example, you can do all kinds of one-to-many joins and data binding and all that kind of stuff, and updates to a calculated field and all. There's so much you can do without writing code. One of the coolest things about Servoy, coming from a FoxPro background, is how much you can do without writing any code or very little code. The client is not connected directly to the database, like I said. There's a lot of benefits to performance and security from having the application server handle things. It's all deployed on the server. And, of course, it's very easy to maintain. You can simply go to the server administration and update an app, and essentially all the apps get updated dynamically. I mean, you could be running an app and somebody brings up a form that was just updated and it runs. People don't have to close an app in order to do a maintenance update, for example. And it uses Ajax for doing updates. In fact, if you're running a form and it has a one-to-many and somebody else adds an order item and you're viewing it in the grid form, you'll actually see the update right on that form, and there's no code involved to do that, and that's done by data broadcasting. So when you have a multi-user environment, even if you're connected to FoxPro DBFs, and there's a change made on a record, anybody viewing a web form or a rich client form that has that data will actually see that update, even when they're just viewing the form. and then there's no code involved, and that's a really powerful feature. Now, on the pricing, like I said, the Servoy developer tool, the community edition, is free. You can install it. You can build apps, complete apps. There's nothing that's functionally that's not available to the developer. It's the same version that somebody would build for an app that had hundreds of users, and you can do full testing and everything. It's a great platform just to experiment with, or to try out and build some of your own tests based on some FoxPro functionality that you have, or just connect to existing DBFs. There will be some upcoming screencasts that I'll go into and show exactly how to do a lot of these things I'm talking about in the scenarios that I'm mentioning. It's a concurrent runtime license model, very much like a typical database server license model. You are paying for concurrent licenses. That means if you have 100 users, but you know there's only 25 that will ever hit the server at one time, you only pay for 25 runtime licenses. They start at $349 each, but it can decrease significantly based on the quantity of users. So each package, essentially, each application you can work with Servoy on in the overall price. There are some browser-based deployments offered at a fixed price when there is like an unlimited number of users. These are special cases. And something kind of new is an optional subscription model where you're basically going to pay a fixed amount either per year or per month, and you can have unlimited deployment, and essentially it's a revenue sharing model. This is more common for an ISV if they've taken an app that, let's say, ERP app, CRM app, and they built it in Servoy, and they're actually charging their own customers for based on like a user scenario, right? A concurrent runtime scenario. And so there are apps out there that run, and the end user apps, and the customer that's using it is actually paying per user. And so it's kind of like a multi-tiered pricing model and how it gets deployed. Servoy's been around for about 10 years. It actually started about, I think, 12 years ago, and it's adopted in a lot of recognized companies. There's a lot of significant apps that have been built and successfully deployed, and these are just a list of some of the companies that have been talking about it or actually using Servoy. You'll see that as the whole software as a service topic gets more popular, Servoy is coming up more and more as an optional developer platform when discussing how to build these kind of apps. Now, this is just a really simple screenshot of a web-based UI. It's not data focused, it's more of a navigational focused, and you'll see that it's running the web client from that URL, and you can just lay this out in the form designer. And when you're building stuff in the form designer, you can actually apply a CSS style sheet to not only the entire form, but individual controls. You can go into the form designer and set controls with a specific ID, and then your CSS style sheet can actually apply. And you can change that at runtime. You can change or you could just do it at design time. The great thing is you could have one or more style sheets that are used for a particular app, and you can actually kind of skin or theme your app your own way. And there are some of the things like colors and fonts that actually apply to the Smart Client form as well, which is pretty cool. And you do it the exact same way. So if you went in and had a label, a certain color and size and font, and you did it in the form, and you have a CSS definition, you can actually have the rich client form, and the web clients take on that same property, or separate ones if you wanted to. This is a more typical data-centric UI app. This is a real working app, and it's actually got a Outlook-like tree view navigator. It's got your standard entry stuff, and it's got a grid, and it's a table view form that does the grid, and you've got your page frames, your tabs, right? And this particular app actually has some cool functionality based on the snapshot of data you're working with. You can export it to Excel document and so on. So It's very rich, powerful, FoxPro-like app that you can build. And even though you can do a lot of things without writing any code in Servoy, there is a lot of power under the hood when you do. It's almost like you have a fast 0 to 60 car on automatic, but at a certain point you might want to go into manual stick shift, and you can get under the hood and do a lot of things programming-wise and API-wise when you need to. Now, here's an interesting, it's kind of a proof of concept sample app that does work. And if you can see on the screenshot, what you're looking at in the background is actually a app running in Servoy that was built with Servoy. And it's got a series of forms that you go in and you set up kind of the definition of an application and your sources. And I went in and without writing one line of code, I connected to the customer table that's in the FoxPro 9 test data. It's customer samples test data directory, and connected to the customer DBF file using the free JDBC driver, and then set up a few properties of options, and then I just hit run solution or preview solution, and it's got this emulator that pops up. And what's really cool is I actually, on my network, navigated to the URL here on my iPhone over my own network and was able to access the app just like you see in this little previewer here. And all this is done, this whole thing was created in a Servoy app. So it's like using a Servoy app to create a web app that has the right images and CSS and theming and whatever that make it look great on an iPhone. So this is not an iPhone app that's compiled in Objective-C and deployed in the App Store by Apple. This is just a native web app that you could program in HTML and JavaScript, but you don't have to do any of that work. You're just doing the data connection, and this little Servoy app handles all the UI look, and so there's no real coding on the client here. And again, there's functionality where you can actually not only view and navigate into specific records, but you can do edits and pushback. And so this might be a really potential scenario for, I want an iPhone or an iPad client or some other mobile client, and you can actually use Servoy to set up the layout and how you want it to look like this and build your app that way. And it's pretty powerful. Now for resources, the main place to go is servoy.com/FoxPro. It's a specific landing page on the Servoy website just for FoxPro developers, and I'm working with Servoy to enhance that content and the page itself on a regular basis. So check back there. I would say starting in June 2010, just start checking there almost weekly for a while, and you'll see some new screencasts and other content. Now, the Community Edition is free. You can find a link on that page, and you can find this information on that page, but for reference here, you can email Evoy Boom, and he works out of the Thousand Oaks office in California. The development team for Servoy is actually based in the Netherlands. And you can contact sales at servoy.com for information and questions about pricing and other things that you would ask Servoy directly. If you want to talk more about Servoy, ask me questions, provide me feedback of things you've done or might consider doing with Servoy. I'd like to hear from you. My email address is klevy@mashupx.com. And on the servoy.com site, you can actually find online forums for developers chat, and you'll find me there and others. So start joining the Servoy community among FoxPro developers, starting to use Servoy, and I look forward to doing more topics and cool demos.